Right now, we are diving straight into a 19th century forensic cold case inside the Tower of London. We're going to uncover exactly why a Queen of England just completely vanished from her own grave. We really need to look past the myths and the movies to examine the stark, documented reality of Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife. Because what happened to her body from the exact moment the executioner's axe came down, well, it's a deeply fascinating and honestly chilling biological mystery.
Okay, so what's really wild here is the stark contrast. Back in 1876, the floor of the chapel inside the Tower of London was sinking, so a team of Victorian workmen lifted the stones to do some restorations. They had this reliable old map, and they found almost everyone exactly where they expected to. I mean, they found Anne Boleyn, easily identifying her small frame. But when they dug down to the exact spot marked for Catherine Howard, absolutely nothing. They were staring into a completely empty grave.
Which brings us to a pretty massive question, right? How on earth does a Queen of England simply disappear from the physical record without a trace? To figure this out, we have to understand exactly how the state disposed of a teenager it had labeled a traitor. We need to flash back to the grim reality of February 1542 and look at the actual legal mechanics that stripped away her humanity before she even stepped foot on the scaffold. Because, Catherine's erasure didn't actually start in the dirt. It started on paper. 2 days before her execution, Parliament passed an act of attainder against her. And this was a brutal legal loophole. It didn't require a trial. The accused didn't even get to speak. It just instantly declared her guilty. Crucially, this move stripped her of literally all legal protections and royal privileges. So by the morning of her death, legally speaking, she wasn't a queen anymore. This completely wiped out any chance of a royal funeral. And hold on to that thought because it explains almost everything that comes next. Now, before we get to the execution itself, we've got to clear up some fiction. You have probably heard this incredibly dramatic, romantic final quote in movies or books, "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Thomas Culpeper." It is a fantastic, defiant line, but here's the kicker. There is absolutely zero reliable contemporary evidence that she ever actually said it. It's totally a later invention made up to fill a historical void. That famous quote, it literally comes from one single anonymous source called the Spanish Chronicle. And honestly, as historical witnesses go, it is notoriously terrible. I mean, it gets the order of Henry's wives completely wrong. It gives nobles the wrong titles. It even claims Thomas Cromwell was investigating Catherine in 1541, which is a pretty neat trick considering Cromwell was executed in 1540. It also says Culpeper died the day after Catherine, when in reality he'd been dead for 2 whole months. Basically, a source that can't keep its wives or execution year straight is definitely not the source you want to build a queen's last words on. So what actually went down? Well, we have 2 highly reliable ambassadors writing home within days of the event, and neither of them mentions any kind of dramatic romantic speech. If a 19-year-old girl had literally announced on the scaffold she'd rather be another man's wife, these guys, who loved gossiping about Henry, would have been all over it. Instead, actual eyewitnesses standing right there, like the merchant Otwell Johnson, confirmed a much sadder reality. She was a terrified, physically weak teenager who had to be helped up the steps. She gave a super short, conventional, devout speech. Doing exactly what was expected of her was basically the very last tiny shred of control this condemned 19-year-old had. Oh, and while we're busting myths, let's talk about the famous Hampton Court ghost. The story goes that when she was arrested, she broke free, screaming down the gallery to bang on the chapel door and beg Henry for mercy. It's a hugely dramatic visual, right? But it belongs in the exact same drawer as her final words. If you look at the actual historical record, there is no contemporary letter, no report, nothing that mentions this happening. The tale popped up way later, and the ghost part was tacked on in the 19th century, right when the English loved giving all their old palaces a good ghost story. It's really just a space filler for a girl who wasn't around to contradict them. When you strip all that fiction away, the actual documented timeline of her final days is just brutally fast. On a cold, gray Monday morning, February 13th, 1542, the axe fell with a single stroke, which, to be fair, was a rare mercy. Just minutes later, on that exact same scaffold, Jane Boleyn was executed. Then both bodies were just carried a very short distance over to the chapel. And this is the exact moment the official historical sources just fall off a cliff. That absence, that's the real story here. The Imperial Ambassador Chapuis noted a really chilling detail. He wrote, after her body had been covered with a black cloak, the ladies of her suite took it up and put it on one side. Just think about what's missing there. No coffin, no royal guards paying respects, nothing. Just a black cloak thrown over her, and her own ladies literally having to drag her out of the way so they could use the scaffold for Jane Boleyn.
This perfectly shows the sheer power of that active attainder we talked about earlier. Just look at Jane Seymour, a queen who actually died in the king's favor. She got weeks of official mourning, a massive royal procession, and a grand state vault. Now look at Catherine. Zero royal machinery. Her entire funeral was basically her ladies carrying her under a cloak about 30 yards across the grass to a parish church. She was shoved under the floorboards without a stone, without a ceremony. Because she was out of favor, the state literally declined to spend a single penny on her. So let's fast forward exactly 334 years, back to where our mystery started. It's 1876. The chapel has basically been neglected for 3 centuries, the floor is actively sinking, and Victorian workmen finally step in to open up the chancel.
Now, this Victorian investigative team was incredibly methodical. They used the old historical plans and systematically found the remains of these executed figures exactly where the 16th century record said they'd be. I mean, they found the Duke of Somerset, Margaret Pole, and crucially, they found a woman of about 40 exactly where the map placed her, Jane Boleyn. Remember, she died minutes after Catherine and took the exact same route to the chapel.
But here's where we hit a literal dead end. Right next to Jane Boleyn, in the exact spot clearly marked for Catherine Howard, those Victorian diggers found absolutely nothing. No skeleton, no skull, not even a fragment. All they found in the dirt was a heavy deposit of quicklime.
Okay, let's get into the science that actually solves this cold case. Why did Jane survive in the soil while Catherine just vanished? Well, it comes down to a devastating biological cocktail. First, Catherine was exceptionally young, maybe 19 or 20. So her bones weren't fully mature yet. They were softer, less mineralized, and still full of cartilage, whereas Jane's skeleton was older and hardened. Second, the quicklime. There's a modern myth that quicklime preserves a body, but in a damp, shallow dirt grave, it does the exact opposite. It aggressively accelerates the breakdown of soft tissue and totally attacks unmineralized young bone. Her youth, the very thing that makes her story so tragic, is the exact scientific reason she literally dissolved.
The historical irony of what the Victorians did next is just striking. In 1877, they essentially gave these condemned Tudor traders a fastidious, high-end state reburial. They soldered them into thick lead coffers, screwed them down with heavy copper, boxed them up in thick oak, and then sealed the whole shebang permanently under solid concrete. But Catherine? She had absolutely nothing left to put in an oak box. So for her, the Victorians just placed her name on a little memorial tablet on the chapel wall. It was literally the first time her name had been cut into stone, finally marking her existence just 335 years too late. You know, there is a huge temptation to say the Tudor state intentionally erased her, that they purposely destroyed her remains out of spite. But actually, no. The truth is much colder. Nobody set out to erase Catherine Howard. There wasn't some grand order of destruction. It was just an utter, complete absence of care. They declined to give her a coffin, threw her in a shallow limed grave, and let basic chemistry do the rest. She wasn't obliterated by design. She was just officially neglected. And it turns out, neglect was completely sufficient. Which leaves us with this totally wild paradox to wrap up our explainer today. Henry VIII lies at Windsor under a random floor slab, his grand tomb never even built. Anne Boleyn is a box of bones trapped under Victorian concrete. But Catherine Howard, the queen who was given the absolute least, whose physical self was completely consumed by the earth, she draws people across the Tower Green every single day. Visitors walk right past the grand tombs just to stand and look at an empty patch of grass. Makes you wonder, did her total, complete physical absence actually become the exact thing